Good day, A1. So for today's discussions, let's talk about the treatments of individuals with disabilities in the olden times. But before we proceed, let's have Energizer first. So the title for Energizer is the Say the Color Not the Word Game Challenge. So let's start this challenge. So thank you A1 for your participating for our Energizer. And now let's proceed to our discussions. So our topic for today is all about the treatments of individuals with disabilities in the olden times. Looking back, our approach to people with disabilities has been less than desirable. There is a long history of abuse, discrimination, and lack of compassion and understanding. One could also argue that throughout history, we have been many forms of discriminations of those with disabilities and included such perceived disabilities as many minority race or female poor. And now let's have the following summary timelines of a treatment of the individuals with disabilities in the olden times. So let's start with the Greek Empire. So during the Greek Empire, they were obsessed with the human perfections, and they believed that beauty and intelligence were intertwined. They must be laid the groundwork for future beliefs. So some societies attempted to rationalize disabilities with ideas, such as Migi Shriver wrote in her research, people who are deaf would not learn because communication was essential to learning. So next, let's proceed to the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire developed a similar attitude to the Greeks. Romans considered the disabled inferior. There was no Latin word for disabled, so the Romans used the word monstrum, which was the word for mystical monsters. So, according to the History Exhibit website, Response to Disability, abandonment, exposure, and mutilation. So, during the Roman Empire. So, the disability was a mark of the god's worth. So, in many cases, it was up to the father if the disabled was to live or die. The disabled children was often taken and left naked in the woods. So, the attitude was to kill quickly. In Sparta, children were the property of the state and the parents with the law abandonment of a disabled child was mandatory. So now let's proceed to the fall of Roman. So the fall of Roman is the rise of the Christianity. This was the time with increased sympathy and pity towards the disabled. So this period is a compassion would soon be replaced by fear. So next proceed to the Middle Ages. So approximately to 1060 to 1490. So a time of social oppression, economic hardship, and intellectual decline. So describing society, Shriver wrote, became fearful of people with disabilities as their attraction to the attraction of the supernatural increased. So those born with disabilities become outcasts and homeless beggars. So during this time, so those born with disabilities were considered evil, and a disability was the work of the devil as a punishment for sins. So the institutions developed more than to hide the disabled than to treat, and conditions were less than humane. So now let's proceed to the Renaissance. Approximately to 1040s through 1600s. So increase in religious influence. So there was a change in the treatment of the disabled with the introduction of medical care and institutionalization. So many of the disabled were cared for by the monks and religious organizations. So Shreve claims. So people with disabilities were ridiculed, such as court jester who actually someone with a humpback. So this time it is under the King James I, the creation of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, Europe's first psychiatric hospital. So that hospital gives King James to the disabilities. So during the 1700s, disabilities were commonplace. It is the start of our industrial revolution. Long hours in dangerous working conditions and no job safety regulations. And during this time, it's have poor medical facilities. So they have a bloody battles, leaving many in a permanent disabilities. So an article by the Stephen Weisman, he writes, in the 18th century, having a disability was a death sentence in some instances. So Weisman goes on to report, those who weren't able to work were often left destitute and without other options aside from begging. So many could not afford to have assistive decides made. So they were the subjects of the public mockery and scorn. So let's proceed to 1800s. So this time is those unable to fend for themselves were left to wander the streets, becoming beggars. So the number of people homeless and living on the streets become a social issue, and new policies develop, as described by the Alaskan Department of Health and Social Services. So disability history exhibit. So moral viewpoint. Persons who live in extremity poverty, including many with physical or mental disabilities, were often put into poorhouses or almhouses, such as establishments supported by public funds, began in the Middle Ages as a means of removing economic outcasts from society. It is a social and moral changes during this time brought training schools for disabled, bring some relief to the families of the disabled. To the next, in the 20th century, Rhonda Newhouse and Cindy Smith and Molly Borgdorf on the American Bar Association website wrote, the laws of the United States devalued persons with disabilities as society as a whole viewed such a persons or group to the people to be pitied, ridiculed, rejected, and feared, or as objects of fascination. Persons with disabilities were seen as objects of a charity or a welfare as a needing to be subject. So now let's proceed to the 907 Immigration Act. So, people found by examining surgeon to be mentally or physically defective and affecting inability to earn a living were not permitted to enter the country or even with a family members. So during this 1907, there was a fear of making US a country of defectives. So now let's proceed to the 1930s. It is the rise of the Hitler and is called the so perhaps the greatest abuse of the disabled, those with the physical deformities, in particular those with mental disabilities, were subject to the brutal experimentation and use of human guinea pigs. To the people with disabilities over the past 100 years was often cruel and shocking. So in prior to 1930s, disabled people were viewed as unhealthy and defective, and thus were often abandoned by their own families due to the lack of understanding about their conditions. So during this 1930s, many disabled peoples have been unhealthy people because they were abandoned by their own families. See, in 1935, Dr. Alexis Carrel, a Nobel Prize winner who has on the staff of the Rockefeller Institute, published a book, Man the Unknown. It is suggesting the removal of the mentally ill by small euthanasia and nations equipped with suitable gases. In 1939, after World War II, Hitler ordered a widespread mercy killing of the sick and disabled. The Nazi euthanasia program was called the Action T4 and was instituted by eliminate the life and quality of life. So during 1939, Hitler ordered a widespread of mercy killing to kill all the disabled individualities. So by 1940, Hitler ordered 908 patients to be transferred from Schönbrunn and institutions targeted by chronically ill patients to euthanasia installations of 8 flying hard to be gas. By 1941, Action T4 was suspended after accounting over thousands of deaths. However, the program resumed without using gassing, instead murdering hundreds of more disabled people by starvation and using others for medical experiments and soldier training practices. So, let's proceed to in the 1940s and 1950s. So one of the first rights-based organizations was set up to the wide range of injuries and disabilities which were resulted from World War II. So the federal government provided returned soldiers with a financial compensation of vacations and rehabilitations. So in this action, it sparked the establishments of the number of both government and founded charitable programs that focus on the rehabilitations rather than institutionalization. So, the research into disabilities provided people with information about the correct types of treatments for different patients during this time. So, in 1956, 559,000 patients were recorded in institutions across America. So the patients were often admitted by the families against their own will as they were seen as a burden. The patients could not contest and confinements. So many suffered abuse and neglected substantial health and safety conditions, deprivations of work and forms of therapy, painful treatments and negligence, and seclusions and spiritual treatments and procedures. So during in 1975, the UN Declarations of Rights Disabled People was passed by, and by 1996, the Human Rights of Equal Opportunity Discrimination Act, the Disability Service Act, and the Disability Discrimination Act and the Nation of Disability were established. And during 1989, the original versions of the American with Disabilities, or ADA, introduced the Congress the previous year to redraft it and reintroduce. So, disability organizations advocate on its behalf. So, on 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was signed into law. So, napirmahan na ang ADA nga act. So, it prohibits with discriminations and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to participate in the mainstream of American life, to enjoyment, employment opportunities, to purchase goods and service, to participate in the state and local programs and services. So during that time, all the disabilities people have own guarantees to do what they want to do. So in 1995, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that continued institutionalizations of a disabled Pennsylvania woman would not immediately serve with the options of home care was a violation of her rights under American Disabilities Act. So, disability rights advocates views and ruling as a landmark decisions regarding the rights of people in a nursing home to instead live at their own home to receive personal assistance and services. So, in 2000, let's start with the 2001. So, in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 was meant to hold schools and educators and responsible for bringing the students to minimum level of competency. And 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 is proving to be making measurable gains and outcomes in increasing achievement. So during this time, the No Child Left Behind Act was granted by law so that the students who have individualities can go to schools and they can do what they want to do. In 2004, Individualities with Disabilities Act, or Individualities with Disabilities Education Act, which was the reauthorization of the Education Act of All Handicapped Children Act. So the changes that were made and included quality of personnel, or IIP standards, and transitioning planning. So the 6 components are zero reject, non-discriminatory identifications, and evaluation. So free appropriate education and less restrictive environment through the process of safeguards and shared decision making. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, is the nation's federal special education law that ensures public schools serve the educational needs of the students with disabilities. So IDEA requires that schools provide specialization education services to eligible students as outlined in a student's individualized education program, or IEP. And 2009, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 was to stimulate an economic activity in a number of areas that include the financial and social institutions, and education to guarantee the long-time economic viability of early intervention services within the education programs. So the economic activity during this time was prohibited to all individualities. On 2011, proceed to 2011, on March 15, 2011, New Americans with Disabilities Act rules came into effect. These rules expanded accessibility requirements for the recreational facilities such as swimming pools, golf courses, exercise clubs, and boating facilities. They also set standards for use of wheelchairs and mobility devices like segways in public spaces and changed the standards for the things such as the selling tickets to events and receiving accessible hotel rooms. During 2011, the American Disabilities Act was being affected. So many recreational facilities have given to the individualities so that they can accessible to all. In 2016, an ethics rule to the American Bar Association forbids the comments or actions that single out someone with disability as well as the other factors. So during 2016 and nowadays, the all disability have been forbidden for all the comments or actions they want. So all the disabilities have a right to do what they want to do. So people with disabilities were not always treated fairly. Many changes have occurred to change the way we treated and the view that others that have different abilities. Laws have been created and amended in an effort to enhance the quality of life with people with disabilities. People's attitudes towards others with disabilities has changed due to legislations which then led to new laws being passed in an effort to treat others as equals. From a historical perspective, it influenced the development of perceptions towards children and adults with disabilities. Societal attitudes are significant since they determine to a large degree the extent to which the personal, social, and educational and psychological needs for a person with disabilities will be realized. To this end, efforts to eliminate all forms of prejudices and discriminations against persons with disabilities by some of the human agencies, UN agencies, governments, and national anti-disability organizations are bearing fruit. A case in point is the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities of 2006 that was signed and ratified by the majority of UN in the members countries. I hope you understand our topic for today about the treatments of individuals with disabilities in the olden times. I hope you enjoy our discussions and thank you for listening.